Awesome. How's it going?
It's going good. Nice to see your face.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I haven't seen you since Surfo before
Yeah,
the world locked down, but
yeah, I know. Yeah, it's like kind of on the edge of it.
it really was. I mean, it's crazy to think that everything was felt so normal at that time, and then all of a sudden it just, you know, everything changed.
Yeah, we were. I think we may have hosted the last event, at least in North America, before lockdown, because we had an event on the second weekend of March, and I remember that just like the week before that, a few of our international students, none of our international instructors pulled out, but a few people who were traveling from. It was funny. Like I remember, it was a few people from Sweden dropped out, and I remember that Sweden had one case at that time, and I was like, that seems a little a little alarmist.
Yeah,
And I remember Italy though was in that full on like
yeah,
craziness,
that was wild.
and yet we were still like, I know my partner and I were like, man, maybe it's a good time to go to Italy, like all those tourist sites totally open.
Right.
And so there's still some naivety there, and I know that at the first day of this we like told everybody to do, they were calling it like the Italian toe tap or something like that, like the Italians were like tapping feet, so we like told them don't hug, that kind of thing. But of course after 3 days at a big conference, what was everybody doing at the end? Big hugs and
Yep.
all that kind of thing. And so yeah, it was and I remember I like through the weekend I was actually getting bits of news, and then I like talked to one of my staff here. I was like, we really need to start working on a plan to like make sure that our health protocols are like as awesome as they can be, that kind of thing. Still really not thinking that it was going to go beyond just making sure, let's just make sure we're doing extra disinfectant wipes and all these kinds of things. And
Yep.
then like, so we came out of the event, I like spent actually my like the last night of the event, I actually spent it working on our health protocols so we could have them the next day. And then a week later we were just closing. It was
uh,
just
yeah,
crazy.
because was that the event that you guys held where you had all sorts of martial artists from all around the world teaching all different disciplines, right?
We did, yeah. It was our
Yeah.
theme that year. Was we've been doing this kind of theme over the last several visits, which is like a this versus that kind of theme. And so this year we did, or that year we did East meets West. And so I was actually doing. I did a really interesting track, which was with Manusher Khorsani, where we did the Bolognese tradition and the Persian martial
Oh,
tradition.
cool. That's
And so it
awesome.
was really cool. We did so we kind of the format of this is in the morning. We have it's all based around these in 3-day intensives. So you in the morning you pick an instructor to be with, in the afternoon you pick an instructor to be with, and you're with that instructor for 3 days. And then there's an elective track that's in the middle, so you can do a little bit of like sampling other people, get some other ideas, and those electives are 3-hour blocks. And so so in the morning you would be like, for example, in our track, in the morning you were with Manusher, in the afternoon you were with me. Now people don't necessarily have to do that, but most people sort of pick the track that's set up. And then on the last day we do a joined meeting between the two instructors, and the two groups come together, and we explore, and this was up to the instructors how they did it, but explore how did those two arts come together. And so yeah, it was really cool. In ours we did I did partisan, and Manusher did, I think it's called Naruz, which is a bladed spear from the Persian tradition. We did sword. I did sword and rotella. And he did I do sword and rotella? Yeah, I think I did sword and rotella, and he did shamshur and buckler.
Oh, nice.
And we did, and I did partisan in two hands, partisan in one hand. And then so that was, we basically had kind of the main meeting was between the shamshur and the side sword, between the naruz and the partisan. And it was very, very cool. It was really, really great. I loved working with Manusher. He's a pretty rigorous guy. He's a pretty like intent martial artist. Like he really brings it. And then we also did a bunch of demo bouts um, on the between the different instructors. So I did a sword and buckler versus sword and shamshur bout with Manusher, which was a lot of fun.
Yeah, so I might have to include this conversation in the
Yeah, absolutely.
podcast, even
Yeah,
though I haven't
I
given
thought
the
that as we
introduction.
went. It's just go ahead.
But so it's interesting that you did that, because right before the pandemic, when I was down, well, I was up in Pittsburgh.
Yeah.
So down for you, but up for me. But I was up in Pittsburgh, and I was talking to a bunch of guys that do HAMA, so they do African martial arts,
Right.
and I was kind of I just had this realization that perhaps our perspective on how the Italians would have viewed themselves in terms of HEMA is kind of wrong in a way, where oftentimes we just kind of loop the Italians into just being a part of the like European peninsula, and just saying like you are, because you are European, that is like that's kind of like your identity. Whereas I don't think that Italians, especially in that period, would identify themselves as inherently being European. As I mean, sure, part of Christendom, sure, but I think that they would have seen themselves more as sort of people of the Mediterranean. Like I think that that's
Mhm.
really always been their identity, and I think that that was an identity that they were trying to recreate. And so, you know, oftentimes I think that we kind of get caught up in looping them into, everything that ends up being like inherently Germanic, but I feel like that's not really the identity that they were holding on to. So I've always been curious about this idea of Italian martial arts, and is it necessarily a response to, the constant German incursions and various like Germanic tribes that came down into the Italian peninsula, or is it sort of this pan Mediterranean approach to sword fighting that encompasses other things and responds to things like fighting somebody with a shamshir and a buckler?
Right. Yeah, it's an interesting thought. Like I was thinking about, what in the same way that sometimes I think about what qualifies, especially when I'm thinking the moniker Western martial arts versus historically European martial arts, that kind of narrows. But when I started, the first moniker that came around was Western martial arts. And so I thought all the time about what qualifies as a Western martial art,
Right.
uh, and so I think about that. I also just think about this about what qualifies as an African martial art. Do the Roman arts qualify as African martial arts?
It's a great
Right.
point.
Like that's kind
Yeah.
of an interesting thing. Does like thinking about like the Carthaginian Empire, like there's a lot of this, which I agree with you, is more of this Mediterranean centricity versus a European centricity. And certainly Rome and Carthage contrasted and complemented one another, and were in a greater relationship with one another than, in many ways during that time, than Rome and the Germanic tribes, even though the Germanic tribes were there. Um, there's yeah, it's there was an intensity across the Mediterranean there. And then also we think about, this is something that, uh, there is certainly a way that Italians continue to associate themselves with Rome, for a long time, because they still do now.
Mhm.
There's still a way that Italians want to associate, many Italians culturally associate themselves with the Roman Empire, even though they also at the same time very strongly associate themselves with whatever their region is, whatever their really small part of Italy is.
Yeah.
Um, and then, and then through that, there is this connection to the Greeks. And because of the revival of classical texts and all that kind of thing, which is such a big part of Italy, and is in the Bolognese tradition, this connection to, especially when we think of things like the partisan and rotella. This is more connection to me. The thing I think about partisan rotella is I think there's that it's hard to say because they don't give us, lots of detail into their reasoning of why they include certain things in the system. But there seems to be a lot of connection to the Greek epics for partisan and rotella, more than there is to, this is a practical thing that you're going to be using on the battlefield or for self-defense or for civil defense. And so that seems again to have more of this interest, which we see in the Renaissance of fencing in that time, has a lot more to do with how do we take this knowledge from the Greek texts, and start looking at this sort of rebirth of science and how we apply science to martial arts and all that kind of thing. So that's also, again, that's not a pressure of conflict developing that art. that's kind of like a pressure that we have now, which is this desire to connect with this sort of classical wisdom, knowledge.
Yeah.
So I think, and that's again more Mediterranean than it is, and and certainly when we look at the Greeks, even now, the Greeks feel often more connected with Mediterranean um, countries than they do with European countries. And Italy's just had a little bit more. Well, maybe Italy's had more invasions,
Well, that's for sure.
right?
Es-
Like
it- Especially when we're talking about like our time period of,
yeah,
any time between like 1350 to like 1550. It's like 200 years of just like constant incursion.
totally. And now, one thing we've got, for that's going to shape our perspective and the Italian perspective is Italy's had many more invasions from Europe over the last few hundred years, whereas prior to that, so that may have influenced the development of the martial art. But I'm just more thinking, I'm thinking that actually that's more influenced the perspective of Italians on Italians over the last couple hundred years, 300 years, than it was something that drove them before that time. Um, when again, yeah, definitely, there's a lot more. The pre-Renaissance period, there's a lot more stuff for a couple thousand years before that is coming from the Mediterranean than it is coming from the north. And
Yeah.
so, if we want to think about the antiquity roots, what the cultural lineage that's building up there, I think it's a very interesting thought to think about it coming from a more greater Mediterranean influence perhaps than European.
Yeah, because I mean, you think about humanism and its influence on, especially the way that people were talking and thinking at the time. And I mean, you don't have to look any further than Manciolino to just see like the influence of humanism on his
Right.
perspective on everything, right? Like, I mean, to start the book 4, we get this, this long, just expose on like classical literature, which obviously he was um, aware of. And I'm reading a great book right now by William Cafaro on John Hawkwood, and
Oh yeah.
Hawkwood is constantly referencing through writings or you know uh, various sort of letters that he wrote to other people, um, his influence and his understanding of Vegetus. And I'm thinking, okay, so we're already like pushing back into, the mid to late 1300s, and you're already seeing this influence start to develop. And this is really what people are focusing on, is just kind of rebuilding this Roman idea back into Rome, right? And
Hmm.
it's crazy because yeah, I mean, I do think that they thought the Germans were just kind of annoying for constantly coming back down, I
Hmm.
mean, every time they get involved in some sort of a conflict and they start to get an advantage, it's like the Holy Roman Emperor comes down, whether it's Charles V in the mid like 1500s, or going back. And it's just it's a crazy story. It's crazy to think, but yeah. All right, so I'm going to give the introduction. I'm going to
All
include
right.
all of
Sounds
that
great.
in here because
That
this is
sounds excellent. Yeah.
fantastic. But so here's the introduction. Welcome to Le Arte Dell Armi, the Bolognese podcast, where we discuss the intricacies of the Bolognese tradition with the practitioners, translators, authors, and teachers working to bring the art back to life. Today's guest, who you've already heard conversation with, is Devon Boorman, co-founder and director of Academie Duello in Vancouver, Canada. Devon is perhaps a man who needs no introduction due to his prodigious output, excellence, and worldwide acclaim. From TED Talks to Academie Duello online, Devon has reached, mentored, and inspired fencers all across the globe. Devon, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's great to be here, and I'm glad we started just right into a discussion. It was super good.
Yeah, it was awesome. So, the first question that I usually ask people is, tell me a little bit about your martial arts background and how you got started in Western martial arts.
Sure. Yeah. When I was a kid, from almost as young as I can remember, I really loved swords and swordplay. I don't know if that's true of. I think that's true of lots of little kids. Certainly we have little kid programs here, and our program started at 8, but we frequently got even like parents of 4-year-olds who are like, "Do you have any programs for 4-year-olds. So apparently I was not alone. And I like sword swinging daycare. I suppose that I that would have been something I would have loved. I don't know if I'd love it as a parent, but I think I would have loved it as a kid.
Well, if you get to drop him off, then it's pretty
Yeah,
awesome,
totally.
right?
Yeah, that's right. Just as long as it's got his eyes. When I come back, I'm happy. I'm just imagining a little daycare with all the kids like in some sort of like little padded helmets and things. You just send them in there, the boffer sword.
That sounds cool.
Yeah, totally. We could have a whole new level of experimental archaeology. Today, I equipped all of the 4-year-olds with rotellas and partisans just to see what techniques they might explore. What really comes naturally to the human body? Wow, I hadn't realized how easy that program was going to be to launch, JD. Like just until this moment, I hadn't realized. They don't even need instructors, just a lot of
That's
padded
right.
walls.
That's right.
Your kid will come. They'll sleep like nobody's business when you get them back.
Exactly.
That's what
Oh
parents
man.
want.
Exactly. Yep. I was gonna say that's what every parent would be like. You mean it? I mean, like that
Yeah.
sounds fantastic. I'm on board.
So yeah, I wanted to. I just I love sword play. I think my dad was a total like out of university, had been like a board game role playing nerd early on, so that definitely had influenced me. I like he read me Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and those sorts of things, and I started reading fantasy novels and then even historical fiction. My dad is really into historical fiction, and so that really imbued a lot of interest in history. And then of course the exciting part often is the sword fighting. And one of the earliest Halloween costumes I remember was a Zorro costume, and so I just had that love, that fascination. And I don't know, I did start asking about fencing or being able to learn something early, and it wasn't something that we knew about. My family didn't really have connections to modern fencing. We didn't know where to find that. It was kind of here, especially in this area of Canada at the time. I think it was really like university was the place where you would get to do some fencing. There weren't a lot of like earlier like elementary high school programs of fencing in them, so it just was kind of like an idea out there. And so my parents enrolled me in kung fu when I was and kempo when I was young. And what I always remember in the classes while we were like working on punching and katas and things, I would look over and see some of these like brown belts doing some sword forms and be like, oh, that's what I want to be doing. But of course, they kind of held a lot of that to much later levels in the schools that I was in, and so it had a hard time sort of keeping me occupied. And I think I was also a pretty sensitive kid. So, like going out there and getting slugged and stuff was not necessarily what I wanted to be doing at that time. And I enjoyed, like, there was, I didn't fully connect with that as a martial art. I also was, like, I was a pretty intellectual kid too. And I felt like even early on in school, there's like a real pressure towards like smart kids do smart things, physical kids do physical things, and I felt like I really got started getting peeled off in this one direction. um, and so that kind of left that in the background for a while. Even though I did a little bit of martial arts, I got really excited about Filipino martial arts when I was in my early teens. And why? Because the first thing we started with was weapons. We got to do sticks and knives and all that kind of thing, and there was an intricacy to it that interested me. I liked the systematic. It wasn't systematic in the way that we think is systematic now, but there was an approach. There was a technique that was being applied across multiple disciplines in a way that I could see at that time more clearly than I could in the kempo and kung fu practices I'd done before. So that was kind of that time. And that whole time, though, of course, I was still interested in history, still interested in sword fighting. And it was through connecting with the Society for Creative Anachronism, which is how a lot of, especially the old school folks in North America and HEMA kind of got started. I learned that there was a group not far from my home meeting in an underground parking lot, so very Highlander, doing sword fighting. And it was kind of a cool group because it wasn't just SCA folks. There was some stage combat people that were part of there. There were people that just came out to do sword fighting, people with some different fencing backgrounds and martial arts backgrounds. So it was quite a melting pot group. And so that meant that quite early on, I went out. So this is like in my early teens. I got there. I don't even know if I would have been allowed to fence in a tournament or anything at when I first started doing stuff, but I loved it. It was exciting. It was exactly what I wanted. I actually really loved, like from earlier sparring, I hadn't enjoyed it. This one, I remember like one of my first things, they kind of got you sparring right away. I remember one of my first times there, somebody said, "How was it?" I was like, "Oh man, I got hit so much. It was awesome." Like I just like that was that did not bother me at all. That I just basically went out there and just was like, I was getting hit all over the place. It was like, okay, well, this is great. And so that was totally thrilling to me. And then I love trying to figure out how do I solve this puzzle and and I had some early success. Always helps you feel good about what you're doing. And I had figured some things out, and felt like some things I tried worked, and so yeah, that was really that kind of launching point. And I had very early on, there was a guy who was in the SCA, but also was did stage combat and became the sword master for the Highlander television series, Braun McCash. And Braun put together one of the earliest, other than maybe there's a couple, there was a Degrassi translation that was pretty early. That was kind of aimed more at theater people, that was published in the UK. John Clement's book came out while I was doing stuff in that time, but Braun had very early on produced literal copy and paste, like photocopier and paste book on historical swordsmanship. I've got to find. I have a copy of it around somewhere. I want to like digitally capture it. But Braun had done a bunch of work because of his stage combat stuff, his interest in martial arts, very diverse martial arts guy. He'd gone and had got microfilm copies from the Tower of London of Morozzo. He'd got opportunities to trace and copy things. He had lots of imagery from historical manuals, and this is pre-PDFs and all that kind of stuff. And so that was pretty inspiring. And he was, and our way of connecting with that stuff was so rudimentary at that time, but it still was inspiring. And so, we were doing some side sword stuff and things pretty early because of Braun's interest in it. And because he wasn't just sort of fitting the narrow confines of what people were doing, like in the SCA, he was doing it for his job. And so he had this broader interest. And so I even was doing, we had a big sheet of microfilm, these tiny little images from Morozzo. And so not useful for the text, but useful to be inspired by the pictures,
Yeah.
And so like, this is again, I actually don't feel embarrassed about it, but in a way you could think back of like, this was like what interpretation was then. It was like, that kind of looked like that picture. And we'll make these pictures go together. And so, but we were, and so there was lots of different influences there. There's a lot of practical sparring, learning from sparring, taking ideas from anywhere, which to me often feels like how HEMA still is in many clubs and places, feels almost the same as this kind of early beginning. But I got interested in the historical part of it early too, kind of in parallel, separate and parallel to, I was interested in steal stuff from it, but there was like a separate interest in the historical in parallel to just sword fighting. That's kind of the beginning story. And that led to me eventually traveling. It led to me getting access to some, Bill Wilson, who we met and became friends after that. He put out a lot of the early PDF copies of historical manuals. So then we started working from those. I started trying to turn. I learned French growing up, so I used that and I kind of leveraged that to help me with learning to read Italian. Because there were not a lot of translations. There were basically zero translations early on. So I started leveraging that to try to like really painstakingly make my way through Capoferro. I actually found Morozzo too daunting at that time to read because he's such a verbose dude.
Some still do. Even when there's an English translation, they're still just like, Morozzo is not my thing.
Exactly. Yeah, so that's kind of a little the beginning. I started traveling all over the place. Like I was traveling because I wanted to fence with people. I was traveling because I wanted to learn from people. And so I started traveling in that time, like all over North America. And I was, competing in SCA stuff, and that was rapier and then side sword stuff early on. There was kind of an early period of SCA, side sword and buckler stuff. So I was doing that. I was competing all over the place. And And just fencing. I just loved going to fence. I enjoyed tournaments. I had a time when that was all I could get, but actually what I really wanted, I just wanted to fence as much as I could when I went somewhere. And if that meant, participating 2 or 3 tournaments, because that's what got me fencing, great. And then I would just keep fencing afterwards as long as I could, until, like I was exhausted or there wasn't enough light, or, like that was just what I wanted to do. And and then I got involved in early translation efforts. Jarek Swanger is quite close to me here, and he was in the same kind of circle as me. So I spent time with Jarek when he was working on Capoferro translations, just there was, and then I spent time with Bill and Gary Shellac, and various people just doing work, and then also Bob Sharon, who was doing work on Fiore at the time, still is. We brought him up here to Vancouver a few times early on. And so there's just, I was just hungry for whatever I could get to expand my ideas. And so, a lot of travel, and then eventually traveling to Europe too. So that's awesome. Kind of the crash course beginning.
Yeah. So, I mean, how do you think, especially now, because I mean, we all know that Jarek's doing the Lord's work by translating all of the Bolognese text. I mean, he's the patron saint of Bolognese fencing for sure.
Yes, yeah.
But how do you think, especially as he's come out in the last like 2 or 3 years with almost all of the texts? I mean, obviously we got Stephen Freitas' translation of the Anonimo, and now we kind of have like all the core text. How do you think that that's kind of changed how you've seen people fencing? Do you think it's improved people's fencing overall now that they've been able to kind of look and dissect?
I think that people's fencing improves in a bunch of different ways, and what we're measuring in improvement is also, that's kind of an interesting question in itself. I think that more accessible texts means more people getting inspired by that particular system of fencing, which means is everything. More people researching it and trying to do the texts, but also even outside of that, it just means more people doing it. Like every person who is getting excited about the text has the potential of having a little circle of people around them who are like, I don't care about the book, but it's sure fun that we're doing sword and buckler, or whatever, right? Like that creates more capacity for that, which means there's a greater community of people who are exploring. And it's, I think sometimes as really passionate, really serious martial arts practitioners who are doing a lot of scholarship, maybe sometimes we feel like, oh, we wish everybody was as passionate and serious as us. But the reality is that our growth comes within a community, and a community needs, not just is, but needs people who come with all of these different types of interests. There are certainly people in my school here that could care less about the historical sources themselves in their study, but are great fighters, and their great fighting helps push the work that those of us who may be interested in, when I've got my scholarship hat on, that pushes my interpretive work and pushes everybody in the group. And the people who are just socially really passionate, just want to be there to hang out, actually bring energy, like all of that is important. So I think, again, more sources means more capacity to have little nuclei of people that are interested in the Bolognese tradition, or just even the weapons and disciplines that surround it, and the kind of idea or general approach to that. And all of that has definitely made fencing better. More people means more better.
Yeah, absolutely. More perspectives, always important.
Yeah.
So who do you think of the 4 core masters or authors, who do you think informs your fencing the most?
In spite of what I said about Marozzo and how daunting that was, I did gradually start to work into Marozzo, and so I spent the most time with Marozzo from time in hand and on doing the assaults from Marozzo and going through all of the different material. So that's definitely had a big influence. But I spent a lot of time, especially after Tom translated Manciolino, and I had started going through Manciolino as well to try to do kind of my own translation of it. But then it was really nice to have Tom's translation. I think he does a really good job, especially of picking out things that are maybe more idiomatic. And I think that's really important. I think that's a real challenge as a modern translator, even if you have good grasp of Italian, if you don't have an etymological sense of Italian, if you don't have a cultural contextual sense of Italian within the Renaissance, the translations you make are going to be missing some important elements. So that then Manciolino, I loved that Manciolino was flowery in the places that you are flowery in a text of that kind, but then more direct in the places that I want a fencing text to be more direct. And so I think, there's definitely been a long period of spending more time in getting more from Manciolino. And then of course I like I like a lot of I feel like Dell'Agocchie has some really nice systematic refinements. I think there's a lot of things that I feel like he strips away, and that makes Dell'Agocchie really interesting. But I haven't like immersed myself in Dell'Agocchie other than kind of help it being a really useful and interesting reference that I kind of take back to think about these other texts. And then I feel like the Anonimo, and so I started working from the Italian reprint of the Anonimo first, and that reprint is just super just on its own because it has this amazing index in it that compares all of the different, like I feel like that was like a game changer in some ways because that was such a beautiful comparative between the different texts. And the Anonimo gave a bunch of details that weren't there, but I haven't gone into it as like I want to really do the Anonimo and do the system as the Anonimo represents. I've just again used it more as a way to kind of expand my view of I don't know and I say this of the Bolognese tradition. We talk about it that way. To me, I'm not certain. I feel like whether that's a real. I think that that's something that we see there as a Bolognese tradition. There is maybe a Dardi tradition. There is definitely a contemporary fencing, like people using some similar language, being able to communicate with different groups. But I feel like it's really, I don't know that any of those people would have seen themselves as being in the same tradition. So that's kind of, I feel like, is a real modern kind of idea. So those four texts that seem to be around the same area and place, and people are kind of doing the same stuff. That's kind of my, Marozzo is what I spent the most time on. Manciolino is where I dig, and then I use the others, and even Vigiani as another source of interesting information to look. He also does some nice job of being a bit more of a reductionist.
Yes.
And I think that's also, to me, I feel like all of that kind of informs me as a practitioner and as a teacher at my own approach to those arts, and gives me again a sense of what are people doing around temporally and geographically around a particular master that I'm studying, because they are I believe that those guys are influenced by each other, maybe not directly, like meaning, they might not actually be reading each other's books, although I think certainly some of them I imagine were, but there's definitely like it's what's in the water kind of influence. That's how I'm working with the texts with each other.
Yeah. No, I mean, you brought up some really good points. I think I've definitely started to gravitate more to Roberto Gotti's idea that it's just Northern Italian fencing, and that's kind of
Right.
how we should really kind of view it, as this is just Northern Italian fencing.
Right.
I agree with that. I mean, you see the same basic core elements show up in the Florentine school with Altoni and with Docciolini, with the Segno, and a lot of similar concepts in terms of the way that they do footwork and things like that. So I think it's hard to divorce everything else that's around the city of Bologna, and nor was the city of Bologna really this big epicenter of anything other than the fact that we just have like this sort of glut of authors that come from this one particular place. But I don't know. I think we'll start to see more similarities. I really wish somebody would give an English translation of Altoni. I know that there's an Italian copy. I actually have a copy of it, and I've tried to translate certain things, especially his two sword stuff. And it's a bear, but I think that I think we'll start to see more similarities the more that we can start to pull out sources from other places. Like, I mean, I look at Livino a lot, and Livino has some really great advice that I think really kind of helps to even further inform what we see from the other Northern Italian authors, and kind of like shape the entire system out. I mean, the one beautiful thing about Livino that we don't get is we get this a true back and forth passage between two fencers. Like everything is a
Right.
documentation of two fencers fencing with each other. So we get the A and the B side, where a lot of times we get the B side left out, other than just like maybe one or two principal actions. Like with Manciolino, we'll get one or two principal actions, or
Yeah.
with Delagoutier the same. But it's nice to see that like this is how a sword fight would go in the mind of a person who is actually there and is a contemporary of the time. I think it's good stuff. The more I think we explore that, I think we'll have a better framework. But
Yeah, and that's Morozzo also has that of these again in the same, very similar to Manciolino, of having these. You do a bunch of stuff. Oh, and they attack your head. That's almost always what it is, actually. they attack your head.
Yeah.
And then there's like in the third assault of Sword and Buckler, there's more. There's actually a lot more kind of back and forth, but it's kind of like Morozzo's way of bridging into the strette, which is where we also get, again, like in Manciolino, we get a little bit more. Here's a circumstance that has occurred and how we respond to it. But I feel like that's it's like it's an advancement on this medieval writing tradition where you're showing these key moments, and it's a slightly more developed version of that key moment. Here's a key moment that happens in sword fighting and how we solve it. Here's another key moment that happens in sword fighting. The thing, though, that we get in the Bolognese text, I think is really interesting. This maybe alludes to a question you've shared that you might want to talk about, is like the tactical system in the Bolognese text. Is that one thing we see in the Bolognese text, which is quite a contrast to things that are going on earlier than them, is phrasing. So we aren't seeing phrasing with a partner, but we are seeing phrasing of this action followed by this action followed by this action, and that's really interesting. And so one thing that I think we don't know is we don't know whether what is part of a tactical system and what's part of a pedagogical approach. How I teach you and how we fight, they are related in some way, but we don't necessarily know what that relationship is. If think of there's certain French fencing schools that spent 2 years on footwork only, and so if I were to see like a recording of 2 years of if that was the record I had, as like a video recording of that French school, would I what judgments might I make about what French fencing was? In a super naive way. Oh, they didn't fence with swords at all. It was some sort of movement game that like it was a competition all about foot speed, or like I don't like, again, because that's that doesn't tell me anything about how French fencers fenced at that stage. It just tells me one of their priorities in training. And so that's just thinking about this transition, what we get where we're missing an opponent, but we are seeing a priority towards phrasing as a pedagogical teaching tool, that you want to be able to move through action after action after action, which tells us something about maybe about what the expectations of our opponents. We have to infer that other side part, and tells us something about one thing that they think is a priority. But I was thinking about it tactically, where does it fit? So that was kind of a little bit of a rabbit hole off of that question.
No, I mean that's really good. We can transition right into tactics. I love talking about the tactics of the Bolognese system. So I'm more than happy to engage in this conversation. But so I think it is really interesting. I mean, you bring up the Stretta plays, and Marozzo almost at the beginning of his Stretta plays and at the start of chapter 3 of book 1 kind of lays it out, where he even kind of gives his pedagogical approach to how he would teach his students, where and I've had this conversation with people about other systems, and allowed Marozzo to kind of inform the conversation when they're talking about different things, like looking at an author like Joachim Meyer versus like what we see from early KDF, right? And why is Meyer why does he emphasize the cut so much versus KDF tradition typically wants you to stay in a sword bind and use a thrust or something like that to come in, right? Or you look at so
Although what does Meyer say? If you read the end of the rapier section, right? Says
yeah,
that you should stay in straight bearing and that you should orient yourself towards every cut simply by aligning yourself at it. And then he says, and this is actually what you should do with the messer and the longsword as well.
right.
Just here's the end, because that's like in the end and in a few of the printings too. It's kind of like he goes through all of this stuff about the cut, and then at the very end he's like, just point your sword at them and keep it pointed at them. Sorry, should have put this in the beginning.
Sucks for those of you who didn't read to the end.
Yeah.
Gotcha. So, but the idea that Marazzo lays out basically is, and he gives an interesting anecdote where he says that, if you only teach a fencer wide play, basically a fencer who understands both is going to chase that fencer across the hall, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so he says that you should only teach wide. However, he says that you should only teach the beginning of what we'd perhaps consider like Gyoko Stretta into grappling, which would be more like book 2 or chapter 2 and chapter 3. You should only teach that to a student who's really interested in sword fighting, right? So to me, it almost sounds like, and you can actually speak to this quite well, right? Like if you're running a business and you're running a fencing school, when people come in and they just want to kind of have fun, you teach them wide play, right? You teach them how to cut and how to defend against a cut, and a lot of emphasis on footwork and things like that. But the people who kind of have a certain attitude are the ones that you teach really closing on their opponent. And I think, and he even says like that's the true art, like that's the core of the art, is actually learning how to close and how to get into grappling situations and how to get into chapter 3 of his sword and small buckler, which he says you can do with all the weapons, right? And so, it's interesting because even from Dallagokye's perspective, even though I think that Dallagokye, I kind of have this view of Dallagokye as parsing the Bolognese system down and trying to basically conform it into what'll eventually become the Roman system, right? Like even the way that he breaks the guards down and really only has 5 principal guards, and they're all, low guards and then Guardia alla Corno, right? And that's basically, I mean, if you look at it, he's just giving you prima, seconda, terza,
Yes.
quarta, right?
Yeah.
I mean, so he's basically condensing the system into what is the modern convention, and he even says that in his introduction, where he talks about how, wide play was used a lot more, talking about wide guards in particular, from the ancients, but the fencing of the day is much more narrow, and he basically says that he's going to teach a little bit of both, but he's really going to focus more on the narrow plays. And I find that really interesting because, when you talk about like the tactical approach of the Bolognese system, one of the things that we really get that's pretty fascinating from Manciolino is his use of wide guards and his differentiation between wide guards or high guards and low guards, right? So I think whether it's like high and wide or even low and wide. So like if you're in a Larga guard or an Alta, he gives you a tactical approach where you have so many different ways of attacking. Like when if you look at his first chapter where he gives his attacks from all the different guards, with his low guards, he talks about how basically, and Marazzo basically sort of echoes this same sentiment, where the things that you can do from a low guard are a thrust or a falso or and that's pretty much it, unless you change measure, right? So Manciolino does give you one instance where you're in Codalunga Alta, and you end up doing this changing step, and that allows you to cut a fendente to the head. But that's the only time he cuts from a low guard, is when you do that changing step to give yourself a little bit of space and then deliver the cut. So, I've kind of been thinking about that a lot in terms of, okay, so the low guards are used for defense, delivering thrusts and falsos. And as you're closing in on your opponent, if you can catch them in a low guard, then you basically know that they're limited to those specific things without giving you a big tempo, which you can then exploit, right? And then you start thinking about Dalagoki's tempos of attack, where they have to chamber their cut. They'll have to lift their arm in some way or turn their sword away to take their point offline, and then you can exploit that. Um, and so, but if you start in a high guard, then you have this like sort of bevy of different attacks that you can use, where you can deliver a cut or a thrust, or you can sort of set up these transitions and things like that. Um, and that's kind of what I'm keying in on right now, is seeing this sort of tactical approach, and Manciolino lays it out pretty well. Marazzo, of course, puts it in like the weirdest place possible. He talks about it in the sword and target section, where he talks about watching your opponent's hand, because he says if they're in a low guard, they'll have to lift their hand to deliver a cut, or pull their hand back to deliver a thrust. But that's kind of where my mind is at in looking at all these things.
Well, I think one reason that Morozzo might have kept that advice about where to look to the sword and target section is just because the target obscures the view of the opponent much more. And so I think that sometimes that's a question that might come up from a student perspective of, when I can't see as much, where are my eyes looking? What do I do? What's not obscured by the target, and how do I keep an eye on the opponent when we're both fighting with things that might obscure our view? That's just a thought on why sometimes things show up later, is that in their pedagogy, that's when that question comes to the fore in some way. When it becomes, maybe there isn't, like often it's not a focus of the system to think about, what we're looking for to predict the opponent. That's not pedagogically important as an early skill. And so it's kind of it's an FAQ skill that comes later on when there's some pressure on it. I think that you brought up a bunch of interesting things about, one about, largo and stretto, and that idea of, you said about, from a business perspective. I think that there's a cultural perspective too, in that, the largo is what it is much more visually, flamboyant, and displays more of who you are as an Italian gentleman. I think about, the commentary about, Manciolino talks about blows from the right being more noble.
Yes.
And, and part of this is just this exposed breast. It's the opening the body. It's, it's much more daring to the opponent. It's, there's a real cultural display going on in those arts, that we don't get. We get very focused in on the tactics of how do I become successful at defeating my opponent with this. But martial arts are a social construct. And so there's really this larger thing going on, which is, how am I displaying myself? How am I winning favor and social standing by the way that I am fencing? How that certainly it's a social construct for us now too, but our valuation has become more narrowed on this aspect of, who scored the most points, or, that kind of thing. There's this much broader social context in the time of these weapons, even in the display form, which is, I think, is a beautiful thing about the Bolognese tradition, is now it's kind of one of the first introductions of a clear display and sparring fencing form of it, versus just an in earnest form of the art. And I think that's a really interesting thing. And so back to the Gioco Largo side of things, why do you teach that early? I think, it has the other thing I think about it is that it is more vigorous, and this is commented on as well. It's more vigorous. It's more, there's the exercise component is there, which is one, Manciolino also talks about why you are doing martial arts. And he talks about the broader, beyond just the preservation of life, but you also do it to enliven the spirit and the body. And so I think that there's that part. If you're coming for your medieval workout, your Renaissance workout, that's something you are selling to your students. I agree with you. I think that there's still that modern thing. It certainly is much flashier. Here in our school, people are often drawn now to do our longsword program as one of our entries in the school versus our rapier program. And part of that is, swinging the sword is more intuitive, and it's easier to sort of understand a story of the sword fight when you don't know anything about it. And whereas, when I have people from other martial arts come in and say, where should I start? I'm really interested. Like if they're real serious martial artists, I often aim them towards the rapier, or even I just, like I recently had a guy come in who's a 30-year teacher of Filipino martial arts. And I showed him longsword and side sword, and then I showed him rapier, and he was just like, oh, this is what I want to do. And it was because it was more, and this is essentially, to my thing, rapier is a streta fighting weapon. It stays narrow all the time. And that was where he was like, wow, this is where the intricacy is. This is where the feeling and the fine moments of the action, and how my body mechanics align with the weapon. And there's like, this is where I'm going to nerd out. This is what's going to forward me as a martial artist.
Yeah.
And so, I think that fits with those comments, of the strata being the place that you spend time with people who are really interested in the martial art. I think part of it is because I think it's more challenging. It's much more narrowed, and so things that are narrowed require a greater degree of specialization. The depth of learning is by going down that channel, versus, oh, you're bored, I'll show you another way you can cut with the sword. Oh, you're bored, I can show you. It's actually really about, oh, you're bored, well, let me show you really about what happens when we change the connection of the weapons just this little bit more. Isn't that cool? And to a lot of people, it's like, yeah, that looks cool to you, but I don't really get it. I don't feel it. Like I think I understand that commentary. Yet, as a teacher, I often would say, here I feel like a lot of my students that started with rapier and then have expanded out, often that's a stronger place to start because it spends so much more time in the strata. And so they have a comfort and a capacity there. They've been forced to play in that world for a really, really long time. And so it's, in fact, I would say that a lot of people who come from places where they spend a lot of time, what I'd say, it's the Largo, when they end up in binding situations, they are least comfortable. Whereas people who started with the rapier, it's like, oh, thank God, now we're doing sword fighting. It's like, oh, I'm finally in the place this is where I've been waiting to get to this place.
Yeah.
And so, pedagogically, like in a lot of ways, I think is a real benefit starting people in this strata place. And now I'm talking about strata really in its sort of barest essential of being, this is the place where the swords bind and stay, and the point stays in presence, versus this is the place where we wrestle. It is the place where we go in to wrestle, but to me, that's not the defining element of strata. The defining element is that the weapons are constrained, that they are near one another, and that is, of course, where we go into wrestle. And especially if we have this cultural pressure that the Bolognese people described to us of going forward, then the stretta is going to be a place where we wrestle a lot more. And that's the interesting thing now, when we're fencing now, there is not that same cultural pressure to go forward. Nobody shames somebody when they come out of a tournament bout because they backed up when the other person was attacking them. Often we say, oh, you controlled your distance really well, good job. As opposed to, what a coward you are. A valiant man always steps forward while parrying, to again, parrot Cementilino. And so, that changes what happens in the stretto as practitioners now more often.
Yeah. And I mean, we have to preface that statement from Manciolino when he does say that he does tell you to step back in the subsequent play.
He does, totally.
So I'm not sure. I've always wondered if there's like this cultural thing where, like, I mean, I know so we've got this group right now in our school that's basically, for one of our events coming up, they're recreating a judicial duel based on Talhofer's rules for a judicial duel and the things that came from Palace Cal. And there, so much of, like the first engagement is the person who is accusing the other person has to deliver the first blow, and the person who's being accused has to receive the blow. And and I'm wondering if there's a little bit of that in there. and you're allowed a step back or something like that, in terms of like your first step is allowed to be backwards, but then everything from there has to progress forwards, or at least from there you're supposed to, you are given the expectation that you have to hold your ground. I'm not sure if there's any level of that expectation in there, but
I think that, the one thing though that we see other than we see, in the Bolognese tradition, we see a lot of exits from play, in between actions. Yet, if you look at like the embellishments, the thing that I think is notable in the embellishments that are described is they involve leaving and coming back.
Mhm.
They don't involve leaving and staying back.
Right, right.
And so, and even when we think of recovering footwork, they always involve going back and coming forward. They
Right,
don't
yeah.
involve, like, if we think about, like, not to fly our conversation off into George Silver, but George Silver, talks about flying in and flying out. He really is talking about a sort of a pragmatic idea of getting out. Whereas I feel like this is the cultural thing on the Bolognese side, is that they're talking, I think, much more of this idea of, like, even when you give yourself some space to do an action, you're not retreating, you're not flying out, you're giving yourself some space, and then as a valiant Italian man, you are then coming back in. You're bringing your full presence back in, because you never really give up ground.
Yeah.
And I think that feels cultural. Like, I think, is in looking through, and spending time in those manuals, and then reading some, also reading more about the times. I think that if somebody backed up a lot and avoided, just used distance a lot, like kind of played what we might consider a cagey fight now, that person would be seen as being more cowardly. That would, they're not stepping in to engage. They're not bringing the fight in. And even if, somebody who takes a step backward and then comes in again, I think that would be considered fine, but as long as it was followed up by coming back in again. If you just spent all of your time parrying, then that would again be, like, whether that would be considered to, lack a particular aspect of courageousness, or fortitude. It would definitely be seen as less virtuous, I think.
Yeah, and I think that's something that a lot of people have spoken to about struggling with, especially like I know Michilino in particular says that you should follow every parry with a riposte. And of course, I mean, that's a sentiment that's echoed throughout other treatises as well. I mean, even with Della Gocchie, I mean, that's one of his tempos of attack. But you get this notion that you should make a parry and then, continue to press forward. So it's like you're receiving a blow, but then you're instantly coming forward. One, because you do have advantage, but the emphasis on that is that you're just not, I think what ends up happening is when you start just receiving blows, that's when you start falling back on yourself and really start taking many steps back,
Right.
Whereas if you start pressing back forward, then you're naturally going to be inclined to start moving and pressing into your opponent, and sort of reinitiating the attack.
Right.
So yeah, that's
Yeah,
interesting.
and I think what I'm sort of driving at here too is that we can, as modern practitioners, we often think about we're thinking about the scientific reason. Okay, my goal here is to defeat this opponent, and so tactically, there could be a benefit to having reacquired control. I want to maintain this position of dominance of the center, dominance of the initiative by continuing to press back forward. If we get these are all tactical ideas, and who knows, it may have been rationalized in some of those ways historically too. Except I don't think they would necessarily need to rationalize in that way, because it would also be this is also an aspect of humanism, an aspect of even things that get expressed later as in knightly virtues, but are expressed as described as virtues of what it is to be a gentleman. There's a different side of things that's going on there that is tactically informing their system, which is the social importance of how you fight and who you are as a person and who you are expressing yourself. And that's something that we don't talk about often Like I'm going to admonish a student for giving up too much ground, basically for purely tactical reasons, as opposed to having lecturing them about where's your spirit, what's what sort of like that. Whereas I think that is something that would have happened in a traditional Italian fencing school in the 1400s or 1500s, is that would have been somebody that they would have been a different conversation, and it's something perhaps more powerful because humans were so socially driven. In some ways perhaps that would be more powerful to have that conversation, to for that person to feel this social pressure to act in a certain tactical way, is interesting. So I just think that's really, really vital when we're trying to extract the tactical system of the Bolognese texts, is to recognize that they're not just fighting a computer match of this physical principle beats that physical principle, or even that bringing this sort of attitude is going to bring more vigor or strength, and that could be advantageous for acquiring these things. I think that there's a way that we have to, when we've got our scholarship hats on, to recognize how much the just what it means to be in a sword fight and to be a gentleman, and why you're doing that at all, is important to understanding what they're doing with their swords.
That's awesome. That was beautiful perspective. Very cool. So we talked a little bit about teaching, and so for you in particular, this is I don't want this to come off as just like pure flattery, but I've talked to a lot of people who have a long tenure in other martial arts, and have experience and trained under people who they deem as masters. And I know a lot of people don't like the term master, so forgive me here for sort of imbuing this upon you. But when I've asked people who they see as somebody exhibiting traits of a master in the general Western martial arts community, the two people that I hear the most are yourself and Tan Pui. And so I've got some questions for you related to really kind of what it takes to kind of take the next step in fencing, because when I look around the general HEMA community or Western martial arts community, and people sort of progressing, growing, looking at the sources and engaging in these really awesome fights, it still seems like there's another plateau that we can start stepping onto and sort of progressing towards. And so what are some of the things that you think are things that people can do to go from being a pretty good fencer to being a really good fencer or a great fencer?
Thanks very much for the compliments there, and I really love Ton. He's great to work with and fence with, and so it's flattering to be in his company too. I think about this, and a lot of the motivation for me in starting Academie Duello was that I wanted to create a focal point where I could train in the ways I wanted to train, and in a way that I could confine swordplay down into a narrower set of skills, so that we could push the depth of those skills forward more greatly. When your club or your group is just a sparring group where you're kind of in this constant state of chaotic exploration, which is fun and exciting and that kind of thing. My group, the groups I was a part of, even though I taught in before starting Academie Duello, were these kind of chaotic groups, and going to a HEMA event, just sparring with a bunch of people, is a certain type of chaotic environment. And there's a place for that. We need that. But in a way that's kind of like you need in pedagogy often, and there's different arguments around this, but I say that there's really strong evidence to suggest that symmetric training is the best starting place, and asymmetric training is the place you want to graduate into. So in symmetric training, where me and my partners are doing the same thing and trying to accomplish the same thing, allows us, that is a narrowing in and of itself. So we're going to be symmetric in that we're going to be trying to implement the same system. We're going to be symmetric in that we're going to be doing the same exercises. We're going to be symmetric in that we're even going to restrict the parameters of how we're sparring or how we're exercising together, so that this core set of skills of our system and even a subset of those skills is being practiced, so that we can push deeper, explore those skills better, and also, use our mirror neurons to steal ideas from each other, to use the fact that we're both trying to do the same thing, to have a conformity, which in conformity, the thing that's powerful about conformity is that, again, it presses us into depth. Whereas when we get into an asymmetrical environment, or into an environment where we're opening it up, we're opening up the walls, we're letting anything happen, then that means that there's going to be there's yes, more exploration, more opportunity for creativity, in this sort of broad sense of creativity, like, oh, I moved my sword in a way that we haven't moved swords before, and I'm doing this kind of like, I'm really like opening up the box of what's possible. But it also means that you're spending, if you think about a certain amount of time, you're expending your effort dealing with all of this giant world of what's possible, as opposed to, again, focusing or digging down into this narrow world that allows you to get to some subtleties of the art. And so to go from to me, from the intermediate space into a more advanced space requires that you narrow what you're doing. And you need to create a symmetric training environment for yourself. You need to get more people, whether it's your students, which is kind of how I did. I had students, personal students, and then I had a school where I had more students, where I put them in a box and I said, you're going to work on these skills because this is what you need to do. And so they spent lots of time in, Joko Stretto, with their swords sliding on each other, spending a lot of time doing things that look like garbage, in a way, to just feel and do a lot of that, so that by the time they, once they put a year in, they probably spent more time working in binds than at that time than almost anybody out there was, because everybody was so, kind of bind avoidant. And so, narrowing is what allows you to drive that focus. And then, I could have started this by saying fundamentals, but it's really, again, about reducing down your environment so that what is fundamental is all that there is. And so, I think that the thing that the community, I'd say, to drive towards that, there's a few ideas. So one, narrow it down. The other is that if we think about a sword fight, from out of measure to making a hit, when we are in an environment that is just based around the idea of the success metric is hitting the opponent, we're reducing the place that we're observing in the sword fight to 10% of the sword fight, to this last moment, this last tempo. And there's 90% of sword fight that happens before that moment. And so the other thing you need to do to get better is you need to create an equal level of value, or you need to create winning conditions that come before that last 10%. And so, in my school, we've essentially, through actual legitimate games that are based around this and sparring sort of context things, we create in our exercises a winning condition that is based around control, as an example. So can I get control? Can I reacquire control? Can I maintain control when I've got it? Can we play a game? Can I fight for as long as possible while being in control without ever losing control? And that can be done, like, it's very obvious in Stretto, but it's done in Largo as well. There's a way that we're controlling the situation. And so by creating that, exercises themselves, people want to get good at exercises. If you've got exercises and drills that you can fail at, then you've created a winning condition that comes before the hitting stage. And so you need to create more winning conditions that reward those earlier stages of fighting if you want to drive people in your group to get good at them. And then when they're good at them, then they become part of that whole. And now suddenly you'll see the people who are able to win the middle of the fight also tend to win the end of the fight. So there's that's another, it's kind of like, so there's this type of a narrowing, and then there's this is kind of on the depth perspective of being able to break out the depth between out of measure to hitting, and being able to parse that apart and be able to create some interim objectives. I even do exercises that are just to do with the first stage, to do with entering. How do we enter? how do we enter? We just do exercise. We're doing lots of good entering. We can still create winning conditions for that. And then, of course, you need to, one thing that helps is having somebody experienced with you who's able to kind of give you a sense of why this matters. Why does it matter to win this thing? Because that's I think is one of the challenges, is that when people are less experienced, the thing that they know that matters is getting hit by a sword or not getting hit by a sword. That's so clearly what matters. It's hard to know that being in control or not in control matters until you've done a lot of sword fighting. And I think that's the other thing that's challenging, that limits people from getting to the more advanced stage, is that sometimes it's hard to understand what are winning conditions that matter early on. I certainly found, I remember watching a video not too many years ago that there was like a HEMA meme that went around that showed somebody fencing in Longanort, and it was saying, it was a meme that basically was saying, if you fight with your point forward, you're just going to get taken, your sword's going to get cleared, and you're going to get smoked. This is just like the stupidest place to fight. And then lots of people were just like, I remember I got tons of likes and tons of people were on there like, yeah, boy, people who fight with their sword forward are so idiotic. What a bunch of idiots. And I thought, the reality is, if you don't understand how to physically structure yourself when you're fighting sword forward, it's super hard and you're going to get smoked. So you actually have to confine yourself in a box where you have to fight sword forward a lot. And once you've done that a lot, you start to actually understand how to not get caught by a lot of the little traps, which actually is the reason that I think that, in a lot of the glosses, Longanort comes at the end. And why Meyer saves straight bearing Longanort to the end is because it's actually super hard. But if you understand fencing really well, maybe you understand some of the pitfalls of fighting sword forward, and then you can really learn the real art. You can learn the stretta, where real fencers invest their time. And once you understand how to do it really well, boy, you surprise some people. But if you never spent the time confined to the box that forced you to really learn how to do that thing, it would be the suckiest position to stand in. I probably, like in my, learning how to win a sword fight in a short space of time, I probably wouldn't have somebody do it. Yep. And so, that's, again, I think it's really about constraint. It's about pedagogical giocostrato, is what is needed to really drive the community forward, drive people forward from intermediate to more advanced.
I think that's really interesting because, I know right now, I just had an experience where somebody ended up basically providing themselves a constraint. We've got this big trend right now in our school where everybody's getting the Reginier short because they want to be closer to what the KDF sword would have looked like. So more like a type 15, let's say. And so people are fighting with shorter swords. And I watched an experienced fencer the other day go up and try to do this action that I know that they're really good at. They've been incredibly successful in tournaments in the past. And he stepped in and he basically did a false edge parry on this person's sword and then started to turn his Sverkow, and his Sverkow just literally went like 3 inches in front of this guy's face. And usually that's something that would have landed with a 100-centimeter long blade, but he's using something that's at least 10 to 15 centimeters shorter. And you could tell like his muscle memory was programmed to that, but confining himself to a short sword actually challenged him in a way where I'm sure that he probably hasn't been challenged in 10 or 15 years. And I know from my experience, even though I have much less experience than he does, I go back and forth between shorter and longer swords, because Manciolino actually speaks to this, right? He tells you to fight with a shorter sword or a heavier sword when you're training, to challenge yourself. So that way, when you go into a real fight, you use a lighter sword or a heavier sword or a longer sword.
Longer sword.
Yeah.
And they get easier.
And they get easier. Yeah, exactly. You're like, oh, I can't believe my point actually went in there. Oh, wait, I've got an extra 3 inches. That makes perfect sense. But, I remember the first time I tried to use a shorter sword, and we had a sparring day, and we were out, we were fighting, and I was fighting against people who I had more experience than, and I kept getting hit. I was doing fine defending myself, but when it came to my attacks again, just like what this other person had experienced, it just seemed to be falling short. It seemed like a lot of my tactical framework was just failing me. And I remember the feeling of just like oh, well, this really kind of like it sucks. Like you almost have to just like swallow your ego a little bit and kind of like when you do confine yourself to that box, like pull yourself back into being a beginner again. And like you said, kind of focusing on the fundamentals. Um, but I persisted with fighting with a shorter sword, and I actually think that made me a better fighter because of like going back and just saying I don't care that I'm gonna take my blows for the next however many months as it takes me to adjust to this thing, but I'm gonna make this work, um and obviously that's a very I don't know, almost a superficial way to view what you're talking about. I mean, I know, I think you've had a lot of influence on Chris, my instructor, because he's definitely that's the approach ever since I know that he's been had conversations with you. That's been his approach and how he teaches us is confining us to boxes, and developing our drills and things like that. And like when we started slow sparring, it took me the longest time to really figure out why, like, what what are we doing with slow sparring? Like, why and one day it clicked. One day it clicked. I was thinking about guards, and I was thinking about tactics and guards and things like that. I was like, wait a second, you know, and I think this came from watching chess, and I was watching, you know, like just competitive chess, and I was watching these grandmasters play. And when grandmasters are playing like over the board, they'll take sometimes they'll take 3 hours between a move where they're sitting and they're
Mhm.
calculating a move, right? And those are those are games where like oftentimes they end in a draw, or if there is some sort of an attack that happens that's successful, it's brilliant, right? It
Mhm.
just like because it takes work to get there. You have to think those
Mhm.
3 or 4 steps ahead. Well, more than that in their case, but and you really have to like construct your attack. Whereas when they play rapid games, they play these really wide open lines. It's where you see a lot of gambits and things that are just like you're just trying to do something very quick and basically relying on your opponent to make a mistake,
Mhm.
and that's what sparring at speed is. You're just relying on your opponent to make a mistake so you can take advantage. Where when you do slow sparring, you have to develop that tactical mindset that you're really approaching the fight like 3 or 4 moves ahead. You're trying to work your opponent into something where perhaps they do give you an advantageous bind that you can take advantage of. And when it hit me, I was just like, oh, man, this is great. And now I love it. Like I absolutely love it. So um
I think
yeah,
that's I love you're of course your listeners can't see that I was like vigorously nodding. I think that's beautiful because what I think this is also when we're fighting in boxes, constraints come in so many different shapes, and speed is a type of constraint. And again, what you're talking about so beautifully is that you had this realization that when you constrained the speed, it actually forced the depth, right? So you went, whereas, often that speed fighting often is in happening in these first couple tempos, like it's people like vigorously making these gambits and
yep.
and hoping their opponent makes a mistake, kind of thing is often what's happening in speed. And whereas when we slow it down, now even a less experienced fencer conceivably is going to be fencing a lot longer, and they get to fight a much more depth oriented form of fencing.
Yeah.
Then it actually elongates this center of the fight, this middle part of the fight, which is the control part. And like you said, you now have to like really, if you're going to hit somebody in slow fencing without speeding up, you really have to like really put them in a corner.
Yeah.
Um, and the reality is that when you get to very high levels of fast fighting, that's true too.
It is. Yeah.
And so slow fencing allows us to actually explore the depth of more experienced level fast fighting earlier.
Yeah.
And it also allows us to emphasize the importance of the control part. And that's the thing I think I loved in your story about fighting with the shorter sword, in a way that created an environment where, whether you were thinking about it that way or not, it forced you to focus on the control part rather than the hit part. Whereas if you'd had an equal length sword to your opponent, or maybe a longer sword, could have been you could have been in the trap of focusing on the hit part for a lot longer. And so often, what I'm doing with my students here, somebody may come to me with this problem of I'm getting hit in this way, or I'm not hitting in this way. But the solution is often not to take that last tempo and figure out how we solve it. The solution is actually to go back and actually put them in the appropriate box for the control part that came before it. Set some new objectives for them, set some new exercises that are about that middle part. How do you never get into the circumstance that you ended up in there? How do you engineer the circumstance reliably that means you're that much closer to your opponent, and so thus you can hit them? It's actually the symptom. The hit is the symptom. And so that's again, back to that original question of what you got for, again, being in boxes. The reason we use boxes is that we need to get away from approaching our fencing based on the symptoms and start approaching our fencing based on the causes, based on and that's when we talk about fundamentals. I think sometimes people think fundamentals is like being able to do my Zverchow really well, or being able to hit really accurately with my point when I'm doing a stoccata, or whatever. Like, think that is the fundamental. But really what we're talking about is it's more like layers of strata, and that that the fundamentals are, as we could say hitting is the top of the pyramid, and that we actually, okay, what comes before hitting is, this sort of tactical advanced control, being in control, this sort of deeper stage in the fight. And then what comes below that? Well, actually being able to, get into control and maintain control. That's kind of this middle space. And then, even more fundamental, that is getting into the control position in the first place, or recovering the control position when you've lost it. This is the fundamentals we're talking about. And sometimes that sort of fundamental can include some quite complex skills. Of course, it includes very minute little techniques, disengage and counter disengages and cutovers and unders and ways that we change guard, etc. But what's fundamental is more that it is the basis upon which you tactically and strategically place yourself into a position where the hit part is actually easy. The hit part's just there. Yeah. And so that's the fundamental that you're talking about, that we're getting to by this putting into boxes that you just started to discover with the short sword, that forced you to work on something that was fundamental, or slow fencing, which forces you to work on something that's fundamental in a different way, as well as doing a whole bunch of other things. Slow fencing, I could talk for hours on all the different things we could get out of slow fencing, but yeah, that's great.
So when you're looking at this, and you're from a historical context, how do you parse those things, those elements that kind of help build up and create the boxes that are necessary for people to kind of take the next step? How do you take those things out of the sources? Like, are you looking at multiple sources? Are you looking across sources for ideas of perhaps this is something that, can help benefit, and like, how do you develop that?
It's interesting to think about that question and its connection to sources, especially at this stage. When I started, the sources were not as accessible, so it was just a very different thing. And, I don't even know what it would look like for me to start, like, truly. I work with a lot of people, and I have lots of people start out, and I started out a lot of people. But especially for me, not in a formal school like Duello, I was just out in the world, and like as many people are, hey, I've learned about this online, and I've got some friends together, or I'm with a small group and we're kind of exploring together. I don't, I have to admit, I don't, like, to think about what that would feel like, how I would approach that myself now. It's very challenging. I'm going to answer kind of in a broader way. I have a couple different hats that I wear when I'm as a martial artist and as a martial arts teacher. I have a scholarship hat that I wear. And so when I put my scholarship hat on, I'm really trying to, I kind of put myself in a box of saying, okay, I need to understand this text within text first. How do I parse apart what's going in the text? What's explicitly stated there? Then I want to place that text within its environment, which can be its social cultural environment. And so I want to understand what's going on. What are the influences on this person? I then want to maybe place it within its martial context. And that's other people who are writing in that time. How do I then have that inform the text? And so that's all my sort of scholarship side. And I might spend time exercising, practicing, even fencing, where I'm actually like trying to lock myself into that book in an explorative way. That's scholarship hat on. And in a way, one of my causes, one of my confining things is the book, what's in the text. Whereas when I'm when I have my martial artist hat on, then what I'm trying, and this is, they both inform each other. Now the causes are not the book. The causes are, what's the weapon that I'm using? What is the context that I'm fighting in? What's the social context, environmental context? What is what are the properties of this weapon, and how does that inform how I need to align my body and work my body? How does this, what is respecting the deadliness of the weapon? How does that inform how I'm fencing and how my opponent is approaching the situation? And do I want to kill them, injure them, disable them? All of this, these are the causes. And these are the causes that the historical masters were thinking about. They were thinking about these things. This is what informed what fencing would become for them. They weren't thinking about, am I doing it by the book? Right? So as a martial artist, that's what's informing what's going on for me, is these deeper causes. We're talking about what's fundamental. And so one thing, I think that it's important that you wear both hats as a practitioner. I think it's important that if you want to be a scholar, I think if you don't want to be a scholar, that's great too. I actually don't. I'm not righteous in any sort of need in any particular direction. But if you want to be a scholar, you need to spend some time putting yourself in the box of what's in the book. I'm going to, and this can be drills and exercises where you start from the stuff of plays, or where you're fighting with the goal of recreating a particular action. Or those are terrible ways to fight as a martial artist, but there's certainly interesting and good ways to fight as a scholar. And so then, the boxes are, I'm trying to create games and circumstances, or I'm trying to create constraints that put me into a place where I can with my brain on, and slow fencing is this too, where I can try shoehorning in this particular action, this particular passage from a source. We're going to do a particular action from an assalto, and you're just going to do, it could be everything from, you're going to do whatever the crap you want, and I'm just going to do this action like you aren't even there, and just see what happens. I'm just going to try and do this. Does this work against lots of different things? We'll have you start in a lot of different guards. We'll have you start with a lot of different attacks. So we've created a box that's about me practicing this action, and then you giving me as much chaos or as little chaos as I want. So that's all scholarship stuff. Then on the martial side, you need to spend this time with this hat on, where you're saying, and this is even, so we can say, I'm going to talk about putting your martial hat on, but still as a scholar. Putting your martial hat on, but still as a scholar, is saying, let's make the box. How do we create a fighting environment where we have the same causes as the historical master that I'm studying? So where, there's certainly some of the KDF material is aimed towards this Frye Fechter kind of, which is like a sporting form of sparring, so, what's that box look like? Some of the spada de joko has a certain box. How do we create a spada de joko box and fence in that box? But I don't need to do any technique that's from, the book is not my box right now. My box is the causes. And so I'm going to spend some time just letting myself fight. And so the thing that the thing we have to be aware of is, if just slapping the person with the point of my sword, if we think that that's part of the box of that particular historical master, then it's perfectly valid. And you're going to get a bunch of techniques that all involve, slapping them with the point of your sword. But if you think in the box, when you do your research there, you think, I think that Mancellino would probably have kicked me out of the school if he saw me flitting about trying to just slap people and saying, scored a point, then that shouldn't be in the box. Right. So we're creating a box where we, so our school, Duello was really formed on the idea of this box of causes, in that we have three tenets, and they are proper arms, proper respect, proper context. And that is, let's use simulators that get as close to the real deal as possible, so that when we can learn from the weapon itself in the way that the people that came before us were. let's respect the weapon as deadly, respect our opponents as deadly, and not treat this as a point scoring magic wand, but treat it as the weapon that it is. And this also means HEMA sometimes goes on the opposite end of the spectrum, where it's like, if you're not like going to cleave the head off of somebody, if it's not like full power, full contact at all times, you're not really doing it authentically. So spend some time with real swords and actually find out how little it takes and how just freaking terrified you'd be of a sharp sword across from you if you're not wearing armor. So that's what that informs that proper respect side. And then proper context, which is, creating the environmental context, trying to create something that puts the social context in, to study it. And my goal was, if I threw 100 people in a room, how could I, if for 20 years, what would be the rules that I would put in place to hopefully have them just on their own spontaneously recreate Italian fencing? So that's kind of the idea that we because I want, as a practitioner, as a teacher, this to be the vibrant martial art that we need it to be, to really be influential in the world. It needs to have life. It can't just be about scholarship. It can't just be about reenactment of the past. You need to be able to spontaneously express techniques based on principles, and to have that be authentic. This is the thing that I think we look to from the sources. To have it be authentic, then you need to create causes that feel authentic to you. So if we can have a set of causes that make me feel like, well, this is really like, I feel like I'm really at least recreating what it was to train in a sala historically, train amongst a bunch of people that could be using it for real and cared about using it for real. So it's authentic because I'm sort of putting the imagination on it. Well, what if I'm in a real sword fight? I don't want to train some techniques that's crap in a real sword fight. That's a way that we can create authenticity. So, and then that allows for some realm of true exploration, some true spontaneity, and some true expression of authentic technique, meaning I'm doing something from principles. To me, my happiest moment is when a student does something that is right out of a manual, but not because they were trying to do something that was right out of a manual. They were just fighting their opponent. And it just turns out that those guys were doing those things because they were functional within their context. So the student did that because it was functional within this context. And so that is, again, this is this idea of these different hats, the causes of the book and the causes of the real martial environment. That's how I think you need to approach. If you want to really forward your scholarship, you even need to do that.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I mean, I reference your video of breasting a pig carcass all the time when I'm talking to my students.
Yeah.
I think it's like required watching, because it emphasizes so well the importance of body mechanics. And I think that relates directly to that, right? I mean, it's kind of the idea that, you talk about the importance of body mechanics kind of fitting into that whole thing, and what the actual martial objective is of what you're doing. In a point scoring contest, something like just a random stoccata that's just kind of like haphazardly just like thrown with the forearm, it'll land you a point, but it's not going to actually, have any sort of true martial context. So, that emphasis on treating this like a martial art and making sure that your body mechanics align with things that actually work, is awesome. Because I always kind of thought about this, and this is something I've gone back and forth about, but like, Manciolino in particular talks about the angle of a cut going from the ear down through the knee, and you think about how steep that is in terms of like the angulation of a cut. And for me in particular, that was something that actually helped me when I was trying to cut targets. It made my cutting better. It made my body dynamics better. It made me activate my hips more when I was cutting, and really start to focus in on getting the rest of my body mechanics in line in order to sort of let the sword just kind of fall and drive through my cut, whereas the arm was so much less important. Where sort of preconceived notion before that, the cut could go through like a 45-degree angle, but your body doesn't really turn your sword through a 45-degree angle very well. But if you start with a high cut like that, and you're kind of letting the sword descend, and you do engage your body and engage your hips and everything like that, you'll turn the sword in a 45. And then It's like, oh man, it's like 3D chess, you know. It's just kind of like this meta thing that comes out, and you're just like, wow, there's a lot more here than I realized. Like there's all of these things, you know, but you would never quite get that from just the, I mean, it's a combination of things, right? Like that's almost like the martial perspective and the scholarly perspective kind of informing one another in terms of helping to develop that thing. Um, so yeah, that's really interesting. And I love that perspective, and I'm obviously it's going to take applying that and integrating in what I'm doing. But I love that because I've been, I think I like working with somebody like Chris, who's my instructor, is very much a martial arts focused instructor with his background. You know, he's got, I think, like 26 years in Kuksul, right? So
Hmm.
a lot of his emphasis is on that. Whereas, um, and he's provided me my foundation. Whereas for me as a fencer, I started to gravitate more towards the texts. And then when I've taught my own classes, I oftentimes focus so much on the text. And I've always kind of wondered where the balance is between those things. But I think you've given me a really beautiful perspective to kind of focus on. So I appreciate that.
Great. Yeah, I hope that opens up some doors for you and to our listeners. And I think it's I think this also this idea of being able to put on different hats is important. And so, let yourself put on those different hats, because that's also just going to expand you as a martial artist and a teacher. Even if you have the place that you love to sit, the hat that you love to wear, it's going to make you love that hat more.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I know we've gone on a lot about the other things, but we need to talk about the upcoming North American Bolognese event that's going to be happening that you guys are hosting up in Vancouver. Um, so tell me a little bit about the event, what the goals are, and what people can look forward to.
Yeah, I'm really excited about the event. It's kind of in a way, COVID kind of helped create the environment for that event to happen. Stephen was it was really kind of the first passion and energy, Stephen Fratis, behind that event going down. He was like, I want to do a Bolognese event. I want to get people together. Where can we do it? And I was like, well, I would love to have people here. I'm really passionate about Bolognese arts. And then because of COVID, we were kind of like, well, we don't necessarily want to plan a big this event like we normally would be. So what if we do a smaller, more intimate, more focused event instead? And so our team got on board with that thing. So the the idea of the event is we're going to do it right here at Duello. We've got a really beautiful space. We've got about 5,000 square feet. We've got room to have a couple tracks and lectures. And happening February 18th to 20th, 2022. As long as the world can hold itself together, world, hold yourself together. And our goal is to it's really putting ourselves in the box of Bolognese arts. Two tracks. One is really looking at what is fundamental, and so we talked a lot about that here. It is fundamental technique and mechanics, but it's also fundamental aspects of fencing, and really digging into that aspect of fundamental, as well as fundamental looking at how and where we might bring that from sources, but also just fundamental of what is good sword fighting with these weapons in this context. And then the other track is really about from page to application. So this is looking at how do we extract great stuff from the assaults? How do we extract great stuff from the stealthy? How do we create the environment where we really apply those skills? So that's a part of it. Another part of it is working groups where we get where we I really want this to be something that people who this is not an event for new people. This is an event like new people are welcome, but it's an event for people who are enthusiastic about these systems. And I want to really get all the people that are excited about it together so that we can all be collaborative with one another, learn from each other. So we're actually creating also some collaborative working group sessions where people will, in the evenings primarily, but also at a few lunchtimes, get together and work on interpretations, translations of some of the kind of harder nuts to crack of the Bolognese text, whether that's, the trivelato, or the traversato, these ideas, these kind of areas that we don't have as much definition of. We can have some violent, but collegial arguments about about what those things might be. So part of it also to move the scholarship forward, and also even we're going to be doing there's going to be a fencing portion, but the fencing portion is a format of tournament I really love, which is an accolade tournament. And that is one that's based on fencing as many people as you can. And then we actually give accolade to fencers that represented skill and application of techniques of the system, martial prowess, and virtue are kind of the three sort of core areas. But instead, it's actually creating, and this is kind of a different thing. This is, again, another historical way of doing this, is that historically there were gatherings, and there are still in Italian schools of martial arts, there were gatherings of schools, and the payoff there was not the person who scored the most points. It was definitely more socially judged as to who displayed the art or the virtue of it. So we're actually creating something I think is more authentic to the Bolognese tradition through this accolade tournament concept. And so we'll have that. So it'll be lots of time for people to spar and explore. And it's also a great format for people of all different experience levels. It's not about who's managed to develop a technique that can hit the most people. It's really, gives you a lot of room. And you can do it all. People can do slow fencing, they can do at speed fencing. It's really about the beauty of sword fighting. So that's another component of this whole event. And then a whole lecture track where we'll be diving into how do you do interpretation, how do you do translation, and so I think it's going to be, just if you're excited about Bolognese martial arts, this is going to be the event. So JD, I'm expecting you're going to be there because I know you're excited about Bolognese martial arts.
Yes, I am. Yes, I'm going to be there. I'm very, very much looking forward to it. I got my passport just for this. So
awesome.
yep.
Yeah, and I know a lot of folks coming from different places are often intimidated about traveling to another country. Even right now, I've been traveling back and forth between the U.S. and Canada right now, and it is not as get your passport. That's one thing you got to do. So I recommend you get on that early if you don't have it now already, because I know things in the U.S. system are a little slow right now.
Yes.
But it's very easy to cross into Canada. Even with COVID stuff, it's like pretty simple. You can buy a test at Costco that will get you on an airline to come into Canada, or you can get I went to a Rite Aid and got a test for free that let me cross back into Canada. So it's very easy to get across the border, yeah, we'd love to have as many people as we can cram into this space to celebrate these arts.
Yeah, that's awesome. So do you so far have you guys figured out who your instructors are going to be, or is there any sort of announcements in that regard, or is that still
well, I wish that I had a few announcements I can make now. I am pretty certain, meaning we've got a bunch of instructors who are like, yes, I'm just figuring out to make sure to confirm the times and things. So but yeah, we've asked a real select group of instructors from around the world. Yeah, there's going to be some exciting people there. So
awesome? Yeah, that sounds great. Well, Devin, thanks for your time. I really appreciate it. Thanks for coming on, and I mean that I'm going to use this podcast as a resource for myself and probably listen to it multiple times. So I feel like if I got so much value from it, then everybody else will as well. I
okay,
can't think
so
enough for
glad.
coming.
Yeah, well, I think running a podcast is a great way to get a chance to talk with a lot of excellent, enthusiastic practitioners and get as much from it as you can. So I fully assume that the selfish motivation of this podcast is a big part, is that getting to set up those conversations. So I'm glad to contribute to that.
For sure. Well, thanks again. I appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
And that concludes another episode of L'Arte Dell Armi, the Bolognese podcast. I just can't thank Devin enough for coming on and sharing his perspective, his insight into a lot of the things that we discussed in this podcast is going to be something that's going to stick with me for a very long time. I hope that you, as the listener, took as much out of that as I did. But getting an opportunity to talk to him and really kind of get his mind on these things was really special for me. And I think this is going to be a podcast that me personally, I'm going to reference for years to come, as I approach and try to learn and become a better fencer. Um, it's just absolutely fantastic. So I can't thank Devin enough for coming on and sharing that with us. Next week's guest is going to be Connor Kemkow. Connor is a lead instructor at the Philly Common Fencers Guild. He is a practitioner of Filippo Vadi, but lately he's been diving into the Bolognese texts, and we're going to talk about what that's like, going from that transition to mid 15th century Italian fencing into 16th century Italian fencing. So stay tuned for that and stay saucy, my friends.